Here's our quiz today. Hit pause, take the quiz. Here's your answers. 2 points for this problem. 2 points for each problem for a total of 8 today. We are going to grade next time's homework on the next class. Today we are just taking our notes out and we're going to talk a little bit about roots. So let's talk about roots a little bit. We're going to simplify roots. The difference between simplifying and with estimate and simplifying with exact is a couple things. Estimate is on a calculator and exact is with a remainder, and here is why. With an estimate, we have to round this number off. With exact, we are going to have something left over. There's no rounding off. There's no leftover parts. Whereas on a calculator, we have to round it off, meaning this is not an exact answer. It's an estimate or an approximate. So let's add this to a new page, maybe on the back. Back in second grade, we did some inverses like this. 7 plus 2 is 9. And if we minus 2, we're back to 7. Now, if we take the 9 out of the mix, then we have a plus 2 and a minus 2, which really we can just take those two and cancel them out since they are inverse, which leaves us with our original number 7. The same thing happens with multiply and divide. So we have multiply by 2 and gives us 14, and divide by 2, which takes us back to 7. If we take the 14 out of the mix and we have times by 2, divide by 2, we don't have to do both of those operations because those are inverse operations and cancel each other out. So let's talk about this. What happens if it's squared? 7 squared is 49, but how do we get back to 7? Well, we could say 49 divided by 7 gets us 7, but we already know that multiply goes with divide up here, and so therefore that doesn't match. So the inverse of squared is going to be square root. That gets us back to 7. So those two right there are inverses. So let's write this on the next page. Flip over to the part that says 9C in your notes. And we are going to write what these inverse operations of each of these things are right here. Now, when we get to squared, we know the inverse of squared is square root. And we also know that the inverse of square root is squared. Now, what that looks like is this. Write this off to the side. If I have a 7 squared and it has a square root in it, it's kind of like doing 7 plus 2 minus 2. Those two things cancel out. So here are the parts that will cancel out. These two things cancel out, which leaves us with just 7 as our answer. So let's try one. Let's look down here at problem number 1. On problem number 1, you'll notice it has an equal sign and it has a letter. So the goal of this problem is to get the letter by itself. So if you notice up here, it says that the inverse of square root is squared. So we're going to put a little squared, and whatever we do to one side, like this, we have to do to the other. The squared and square root cancel out, which leaves us with v. And on the previous page, you have some shortcuts for these squares and square roots. On the previous page, it'll have a little column that says 3 squared, and we know that 3 squared equals 9. That is the answer to that problem. So let's look at some of these problems. Let's try this one first. The square root of b equals 4. We know that the square root, inverse of square root, is squared. So we're going to square both sides. Those cancel and leave us with just b. And 4 to the second power is 16. That is our answer. Now, this gets a little bit tricky. This one right here says 25n in the square root equals 5. The hard part on this one is that the square root is like a parentheses. It's holding the 25 and the n together underneath the square root roof. So in order to do anything with either of those, we've got to square it. In order to, if we square that side, we have to square this side. The square and square root cancel out, leaving us with 25n equals 25. And this from here is like we did back in chapter 1. We just do some math, divide that, and we get 1 as our answer. And that's the answer to that problem. So let's look at what happens with this one. This one's a little bit tricky, and here is why. Notice I have a squared on this one. The others we've been dealing with a square root. This one has a squared, and let's talk about why this is tricky. The inverse of squared is square root, so I put one on the x and I put one on the 9 because whatever I do to one side I have to do to the other. Those two things cancel out, leaves me with x equals the square root of 9, which is 3. Because 3 times 3 equals 9, but if you notice, negative 3 times negative 3 is what? We know it equals 9 as well. So which of these answers is it? Well, if you have a problem that has a little squared in the original equation, you're going to have both of them are going to be the answer to your question. So this one has two answers, a positive 3 and a negative 3 are the answers. And right up here by the green square, that's how you can tell this problem is going to have two answers, is because it started with a squared. So let's look over on your page that says 9C, and we're going to look at some of these and decide which one of these problems are going to have two answers. Now, look at the problems, and we're looking for a problem that has a squared in the original problem. Number 4 has a squared, number 7 has a squared, and number 8 has a squared. So these are going to have a negative and a positive answer in both of these, in all three of these problems. So let's try number 4. I want you to give, these are the three parts of number 4 that need to be moved. Pause the video, and let's have you give this a try. Now that you've had a minute to try it, here's your little hint. Order of operations, when we are undoing an equation, we start not from the top, we start from the bottom. Undoing, we do order of operations backwards. So add and subtract is going to be first, which means my 5, and that simplifies to this. If you did not, pause the video for a second and then check and see if you got that far. Here is the next step. The next one is multiply and divide. So we are going to divide by 10, which leaves us with r squared equals 36. Now, inverse operation of a squared is going to be square root. Whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. Because it has a 2 on it, I know this is going to be positive or negative 6. So I want you to pause the video and I want you to try number 6. Give number 6 a try on your own. Here's the solution for number 6. When we do order of operations, we're going to start with the add and subtract first. That's going to be minus 9. That gives me 27. If you look on the previous page, it has some of these. Up here on the top, we didn't talk about this, but the inverse of cubed is going to be cube root. So write this at the top where your notes are. The inverse of cube is cube root. And the inverse of cube root is going to be cubed. So that's what we're going to do on this problem. We're going to cube root it, and those two parts cancel out. And then we just need to look on the previous page and see what number to the third power equals 27. And if you notice, that answer is 3. Now, let's try one of these tricky parts. Pause the video. Here are the 3 parts that need to be moved. I want you to try this and then play the video after you've had a minute to do this problem. 10 is the first part that moves, which gives us 20. And if we rewrite the problem, it gives us that. Pause the video and see if you got that and your neighbor got that. Next step is divide by 5, which leaves me this. Now, before we go any further, let's check and see. This is going to be a squared on it. That means we are going to have 2 answers. Inverse of squared is square root. Whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. This is going to have 2 answers. Because of the squared, we have positive and negative 2. Now we're not going to do that tricky problem. We'll try this one. This might be helpful to write this problem down. We cannot put these 2 things together if they are underneath the square root roof together, because they are being held captive. So we need to square this side, and whatever we do to that side, we have to square the other. This gives us 2n plus 8, and on the other side, these cancel and leave us with 9n plus 1. And we're back to chapter 1 stuff from this year. Put the like parts together and solve it from there. There's only 1 or 2 of those tricky ones on your assignment today. Now, let's look at this problem. I want you to pause the video, and I want you to work this problem out and check with your neighbor to see if they got the same answer as you. Now we're going to work this problem out. The first thing we're going to move is the 12, minus 12 from both sides. And then the next thing we're going to do, the inverse of squared is square root. Whatever we do to one, we have to do to the other. These cancel. Because there is a squared, it's going to have 2 answers. And the answer is going to be x is negative and positive 6. So here is your homework pickup problem. Make sure that if you had some questions on today's homework, on today's notes, that you work with someone that understood them. Send me an email if you have some questions on this, and we will go over any questions when I am back.